Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is pretty specific but really crucial, the 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was ratified back in 1804. Now, this amendment wasn't just some minor tweak. It was a direct, almost emergency reaction to, well, the utter breakdown of the original way we elected presidents. Specifically, it stemmed from that terrifying constitutional crisis in the 1800 election where, frankly, the nation was teetering on the brink for weeks. So the central question we really need to grapple with today is this. Did the 12th Amendment successfully resolve the fundamental defects of the original system laid out in Article 2, or did it just act as a kind of Band-Aid, maybe institutionalizing political parties while leaving some dangerous structural flaws untouched? My argument today is that the amendment was necessary, pragmatic, and yes, ultimately a successful piece of political realpolitik that saved the young republic.
Okay. And I see it quite differently. While I absolutely agree that something had to be done after the paralyzing deadlock of 1800, that's undeniable. I think the solution adopted, the 12th Amendment, really only addressed the surface symptoms. It didn't get to the underlying disease, so to speak. Yes, it fixed the mechanical problem of the tie vote. But in doing that, it completely failed to safeguard against these really critical anti-majoritarian problems baked into the system. For me, it represents a significant missed opportunity for genuine structural reform. It basically codified party dominance and I think undermined the founders' original vision of careful, nonpartisan deliberation.
Right. Well, to really get a handle on the gravity of the situation back then, we have to remember just how quickly the original system proved, frankly, unworkable. I mean, it only took 4 elections. 4! Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3, that initial idea where electors cast 2 votes but didn't differentiate between president and VP, winner takes president, runner-up gets vice president, that was fatally flawed from almost the get-go. We saw the first signs of trouble in the, let's call it, unusual election of 1796, right? That produced a deeply divided executive. Federalist John Adams as president and Republican Thomas Jefferson as vice president. That created friction, sure. But 1800? That was the real test. Thomas Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, tied. 73 electoral votes each.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant the decision got thrown into the lame duck House of Representatives, which happened to be controlled by the Federalists. Can you imagine the anxiety? It took 36 agonizing ballots. There were political maneuvers, rumors flying about armed resistance. The Federalists were even trying to elevate Burr over Jefferson, their ideological enemy. So the 12th Amendment's main fix, the simple idea of separate ballots for president and vice president, was a direct, pragmatic solution. It streamlined the process, it accommodated the, let's face it, unavoidable reality of political parties, and it ensured the government could actually function. And crucially, it included that vital contingency provision. If the House fails to choose a president by Inauguration Day, March 4th back then, now January 20th, the vice president-elect acts as president. That was absolutely key to preventing a total power vacuum.
Okay, focusing on the immediate crisis, the transfer of power, I get that. But my point is that doing so sacrificed the, let's say, long-term health of the republic. The amendment's success, as I see it, was largely cosmetic. By creating those separate ballots and therefore implicitly recognizing the whole concept of a ticket, the 12th Amendment didn't just accommodate parties, it fundamentally changed the nature and role of the Electoral College itself. The Supreme Court even noted later, and I think this is important, that the amendment acknowledged and facilitated the college becoming a tool not for genuine deliberation, where electors might independently choose the best men, but for strict party line voting. So we essentially traded the ideal of independent assessment for party loyalty. And perhaps even more dangerously, the amendment deliberately kept the most problematic part of the contingent election process. The House of Representatives still chooses the president by states. That means every single state delegation, whether it's tiny Wyoming or massive California, gets exactly 1 vote. This structural flaw, this deeply anti-majoritarian structure, it remains a persistent threat to democratic legitimacy today.
I understand the philosophical objection, I do, the idea of institutionalizing factions or parties. But look, the founders hoped that
political parties wouldn't form, let's be frank, that was probably naive from the very beginning. You saw the profound philosophical differences between Hamilton and Jefferson emerge almost immediately, right within Washington's own cabinet. So the 12th Amendment wasn't destroying some pristine ideal. It was responding to the practical reality that these factions had formed, and they were already driving the machinery of government. To refuse to acknowledge them in the Constitution, well, that would likely have just led to more backroom deals and chaos. The amendment was an essential adjustment, a realpolitik move, ensuring that the executive team chosen actually reflected the electors and, by extension, the voters' real intent for the president and vice president, together as a team. It also, importantly, curtailed the risk of the vice president being used as some kind of internal party pawn, which is exactly what Aaron Burr seemed to be trying to exploit in 1800.
I'm just not convinced that the, let's call it, political convenience of streamlining the ticket was worth the systemic cost. Explicitly institutionalizing this party voting immediately led to some very well-founded concerns about the quality, maybe even the independence of the vice presidency. You had Senators White and Tracy at the time expressing these deep reservations. They worried, and I quote here, that presidential candidates would now look for vice presidents based not on their talents, probity, and popularity, but more on their ability to promote the election of a president through things like connections or wealth or local situation. They actually feared a conscious selection of people with, let's say, moderate talents, who wouldn't pose a political threat or rivalry to the president. This suggests the 12th Amendment might have actually incentivized picking a subordinate, maybe, rather than a potential successor, trading genuine leadership potential for party harmony.
Well, the political system, when it was faced with what felt like an immediate threat of national dissolution, it prioritized stability. And while you can argue that the quality of the vice presidency potentially diminished, and I think that's debatable, we've had some very capable VPs since then, the alternative seemed to be a constant state of political warfare, maybe even chaos, every 4 years. The 12th Amendment, whatever its flaws, ensured the successful continuation of the Republic through a peaceful, predictable transfer of power. That predictability was something entirely missing under the old system. So the mechanism of the ticket, yes, it institutionalized party lines, but it provided clarity and minimized that potential for internal betrayal or manipulation. That's arguably what the country needed to survive its infancy.
Survival, perhaps, but potentially at the cost of long-term legitimacy. And the greatest danger, I still believe, lies dormant in the mechanism you decided not to fix, the House contingent election. That structure, where if no candidate gets an electoral college majority, the House picks the president, voting by states. This is, I think, profoundly dangerous. Why? Because the smallest state, maybe 600,000 people, gets the exact same single vote as the largest state with nearly 40 million. That's a population difference of almost 70 times.
Right.
And this grossly anti-majoritarian system, crucially, doesn't even require the state delegation to vote according to their state's popular vote. Think about today's highly gerrymandered districts. It's entirely conceivable that a small number of representatives, maybe from a minority of the state's population-wise, could select a president who didn't win the popular vote, or even a plurality of the Electoral College. That creates a recipe for profound instability and, frankly, a deep lack of trust in the outcome.
Okay, that argument, while it emphasizes majority rule, it kind of overlooks the foundational structure of the American system, doesn't it? I'd argue that keeping the vote by state mechanism in the House wasn't a flaw of the 12th Amendment, but rather a necessary deference to the Federalist principle. That principle was arguably essential for the Union's existence in the first place. That one state, one vote idea reflects the equality of states in their sovereign capacity, much like the structure of the Senate does. The framers, well, they intentionally designed the system to require both a national consensus through the electors and a state consensus if things went to the House. Trying to reform that specific provision back in 1804, that probably would have been politically impossible, and it might have fundamentally undermined the big compromises made back in 1787.
Impossible or not, I call it structurally negligent. And we saw the result of this negligence play out pretty clearly in 1824. You had Andrew Jackson, who won more popular votes and more electoral votes than anyone else, but not a majority. And he lost the presidency to John Quincy Adams in the House vote. Why? Well, it was widely seen as influenced by Henry Clay, who came in fourth. Clay allegedly threw his support and therefore the votes of the delegations he controlled to Adams in exchange for becoming Secretary of State. That outcome, the so-called corrupt bargain, it seriously undermined public faith in the whole process, and it was the vote-by-state mechanism preserved by the 12th Amendment that made it possible.
That's an interesting point about 1824 testing that anti-majoritarian structure. Yes. But let me bring it back to the improvements the 12th Amendment actually did make to that contingent process. It was precisely the chaos of that four-candidate split in 1824, Jackson, Adams, Crawford, Clay, that actually highlights the wisdom of the new limitation the amendment put in place. Remember, the 12th Amendment improved the contingent election rules. It restricted the House's choice for president from the original top 5 candidates down to the top 3. This was crucial in 1824 because it ensured the immediate elimination of the fourth-place finisher, Henry Clay. That streamlined what was already a very difficult decision and prevented the choice from being even more complex or delayed. And we often overlook the procedural success regarding the vice presidency. The 12th Amendment explicitly gave the VP contingent election to the Senate, and importantly, limited their choice to only the top 2 VP candidates. This mechanism works completely differently from the House's state-based vote. It's a simple roll call, 1 senator, 1 vote. And that structure proved its worth, didn't it? In 1837, the Senate successfully elected Richard Mentor Johnson as vice president after he fell just a few votes short of an electoral majority. So the procedural fixes, where they could be implemented without dismantling that core federalism, they were actually quite sound and robust.
But the successful use of the Senate rule in 1837 only reinforces my point about the House. The Senate procedure works smoothly because it avoids the vote-by-state problem. The House procedure remains dangerously flawed because it keeps that state-based voting and requires that tricky quorum of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, maintaining the imbalance. The fundamental issue, failing to win an electoral college majority, that remains the critical vulnerability in the system. And that vulnerability, whether it leads directly to a House decision like in 1824 or contributes indirectly to the controversies of modern elections like 2000 or 2016, where the popular vote winner lost, it systematically undermines public confidence. By focusing so narrowly on fixing the 1800 tie, the 12th Amendment basically gave political cover to resist more fundamental reform of the Electoral College itself later on.
Well, I think the discrepancies you point to, like 2000 and 2016, those are really consequences of the Electoral College's basic design, particularly the state-level winner-take-all laws that evolved much later. They aren't really a direct result of the 12th Amendment's separate ballot provision. The 12th Amendment achieved its specific targeted objective. It stopped the executive branch from being paralyzed by an electoral tie, and it established a clear line of succession for the power transition. That was the paramount constitutional danger after 1800. It solved a problem it was designed to solve. To ask it to also solve the much broader philosophical debate between majoritarianism and federalism, I think that's misreading its purpose in the context of 1804.
I remain unconvinced you can separate the procedure from the structural reality like that. By formalizing party line voting and failing to get rid of that severely anti-majoritarian vote-by-state mechanism in the House, the 12th Amendment ensured that the core structural vulnerability of the American electoral system persisted. It perpetuated the very conditions that continue to lead to legitimacy crises whenever the Electoral College outcome diverges sharply from the popular will. I mean, that's why modern reform proposals so often target that specific mechanism, suggesting changes like moving to 1 representative, 1 vote in contingent elections. It shows the flaw is indeed fundamental.
Ultimately, though, the 12th Amendment has to be seen as a necessary and, I believe, successful act of legislative adaptation for its time. It ensured political stability. It provided a clear mechanism for transferring power after that bitter, paralyzing fight in 1800, a major test that the young nation honestly might not have survived otherwise. It streamlined the contingent process where it realistically could, limiting the House's pool of choices, clarifying the VP role. It achieved what was politically possible and constitutionally urgent back in 1804.
And yet, for me, it remains a powerful testament to a missed opportunity for deeper, true structural reform. By sacrificing the ideal, however naive, of nonpartisan deliberation, and by preserving the dangerous asymmetry of state power in the House contingent election, the amendment left the door wide open for exactly the kind of electoral contention and legitimacy challenges that, well, we're still grappling with today.
The source material certainly confirms that constitutional change is inherently difficult. It's often defined by what's possible, perhaps, rather than what might be ideal in the abstract.
And the complex procedures around contingent elections, coupled with that inherent tension between the popular will and state-based power, they absolutely remain central features and central uncertainties of the American electoral landscape.